Well, it's good to see everybody here this morning on this beautiful Easter day. I was thinking driving over this morning, this time last year, we were in the midst of a pandemic, in the beginning of it, and I was crammed in my little office trying to lead music online and all that crazy stuff, and it was kind of a disaster this time last year, and just to think about today, but it's so exciting. And I'm sure a lot of y'all, I know we have a lot of family here today, probably going to be going out to eat or going over to Mom's house. Anybody doing that today? Yeah. We are going on a food tour after church today. We are heading to Pendleton to eat with my mom's side of the family. Then we're going to Alexandria to eat with my dad's side of the family, and I will be passed out by about 8 o'clock tonight. And do what? Yeah. So I'm trying to get my 10,000 steps in here before I go, so I can gorge myself there. But my uncle that we're going tonight to eat with is a historian, and he taught history for 30 years up in Orestes area. And so when they always came to town, to Chattanooga, my parents are here from Chattanooga, when they had come down to Chattanooga, we would always go visit all the war things down there. And my uncle prepared for me a book a few years ago of a lot of my relatives, and some of y'all know his son, my cousin, is a huge genealogy guy. He's got thousands, tens of thousands of files. So we've got my family tree back to the 1500s, back to Scotland. You're kind of obsessed when your day off you go to cemeteries. That's what he does. And he's just obsessed with genealogy. And anyways, one thing I discovered was I have a great-great-great-grandfather who is buried right up the road here in Westfield, Indiana. In fact, we used to live in Carmel, Westfield, right there on the edge, and his gravesite was about 10 minutes from us, and I went over there once and visited it. And he fought in the Civil War, and he's buried there in Westfield. He fought for the Indiana Regiment. And I was thinking, if I could somehow travel back in time to the 1860s, 1870s, when Grandpa Beale was alive, and I said, hey, great, whatever, grandfather, I'd leave off all the greats. Did you know, great-grandfather, that in less than 150 years, people could get in these pressurized tubes and fly around the world? And now my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather would say, no way. Only birds can fly. You mean to tell me people are going to get in some pressurized tube and fly? Yeah, grandfather, they're going to call it an airplane. He's like, no way. And I said, oh, great-great-grandfather, if you knew that in less than 150 years from now, that people will have in their rooms, in their living rooms, this big black screen on the wall, and they can watch events that are happening all over the world in real time, my great-great-great-great-grandfather would have said, no way. By the way, what's a TV? What is that? And if I were to go to my great-great-great-great-grandfather and say, did you know that in less than 150 years, you don't have to get in your horse and buggy. You can get in this car, this automobile, turn it on. It has no horses attached to it. And you can drive from one end of the country to the other. In fact, great-great-great-grandfather fought down there in Tennessee. You could drive from Westfield, Indiana, down to Chattanooga, Tennessee in about 8.5 hours. My great-great-great-grandfather say, no way. That took us months to get out there. That is impossible. You say, but it is. It's possible. And he'd say, by the way, what is an automobile? What is that thing? And then if I said, great-great-great-great-grandfather, did you know that in less than 150 years, you would have this thing on your wrist that would track how many steps you take, that would tell you when it's time to wake up, that you could receive text messages on, and even take telephone calls on? He'd say, well, what's a telephone call? Well, it's this thing, grandfather, where you can sit in your living room and you can pick up this device and you can talk to somebody on the other side of the world. And he would say, what? No way. There is no way this sort of thing would ever happen. And you and I have used that phrase a lot, right? There's probably been times when you've gotten the shocking news of a death of a friend. And you found yourself saying, no way. I just saw her the other day. She was fine. What do you mean she passed away? No way. Or maybe ladies, back, at some point you found out you were expecting a child and you said, no way. Holy cow. We say that, right? We use that word no way when we think, when something seemingly untrue, impossible, is told to us or unexpected. You get passed over for a promotion at work and you're like, no way, I worked harder than that person. I should have gotten that promotion. Why didn't I get that promotion? Or when, ladies were dating this guy and he starts taking interest in this other girl, and he falls for her and you're like, no way, I'm way cuter than her. Why did he go after her? We use that phrase when the seemingly impossible happens, something we could never conceive happening. Well, today, literally around the world, Christians are gathered in buildings like this, or they're gathered in homes, or some in caves, because they could be killed for worshiping Christ. And there are approximately maybe up to 2 billion people today around the world who are celebrating the resurrection of this man, Jesus. Now, rationally, you would say, no way. People do not come back from the dead. Unfortunately, I've performed hundreds of funerals. I've never seen anybody come out of that casket. And so this idea that this man rose from the dead, rationally you say there is absolutely no way. And rationally you're thinking there's got to be a logical explanation for this whole story. Maybe they went to the wrong tomb, or maybe the Bible's just making up this myth or this fairy tale, or maybe his disciples stole his body. I mean, it's just not rational. People just don't rise from the dead. But how is it that a couple thousand years later, people all over the world are today celebrating the resurrection of Jesus? And when you think about it, this seems to be one of those no way things. I mean, there's no way to rationally explain why a couple billion people around the world are celebrating the death and resurrection of a Jewish carpenter. Thousands of Jewish carpenters have lived, and we're not celebrating them. Why this guy? I mean, it seems like defies explanation of how all these people be worshiping the resurrection of this man who died a crucified death. He died as a common criminal. Why in the world are we celebrating him this day? It seems irrational that somehow we're celebrating this guy who was crucified 2,000 years ago on the other side of the world in this little dinky country that was under the thumb of the Roman Empire. It doesn't seem rational that today we are celebrating him. It doesn't seem rational that we are celebrating this guy who was so poor. He said he didn't even own a home. He never wrote any books. He never led any military conquests. He was not an academic professor. He didn't even have a family to carry on his name. And yet here we are, 2,000 years later. No way. Why are we here? Well, if you have your Bibles, and we'll put it on the screen, and I guess my clicker is not up here. I thought about that during Sunday school and forgot about it, so you can follow along in the balcony. You don't need to bring it down, Rob. Just follow along in the balcony to Matthew chapter 27. And I want to read to you Matthew's account of the story here, Matthew chapter 27. And we're just going to jump right in here at verse 57. And it goes like this, Matthew 27, verse 57. So Jesus has been crucified. He's died. And so the story continues. When it was evening, a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph came, who himself had also become a disciple of Jesus. Now, again, let me just stop right here because this is another one of those no way things. If you don't know who Joseph of Arimathea was, let me tell you who he was. He was a member of the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was the religious council. It was the religious council that put Jesus on trial, and it was that same council who condemned him to die. Members of the Sanhedrin council who were there along with Joseph of Arimathea were the ones who incited the crowd to start yelling, "Crucify him, crucify him." And yet here's this guy who's a member of this council, but he had become a disciple of Christ. Now, at this point, John tells us he had become secretly a disciple because he was afraid he would be killed. But here this man was who sat through all the trial. Here this man was who watched Jesus for the last 3 years, who scrutinized his life. And again, the Sanhedrin, these were people who knew the Scriptures. They knew the Old Testament Scriptures. And yet when he started looking things up and when he started watching Jesus, he had come to this point where he said, he must be him. He must be him. And so Joseph goes, and look at what happens here in verse 59. So Joseph took the body. He approached Pilate, verse 58, and asked for Jesus' body. Then Pilate ordered it to be released, verse 59. So Joseph took the body, wrapped it in a clean, fine linen, and placed it in his new tomb, which he had cut into the rock. He left after rolling a great stone against the entrance of the tomb. So just think about this. And if you were making this story up, because there's people like, well, this is all made up. This is just a myth. First of all, there's a lot of reasons that this is not a made-up story. First of all, if this were a made-up story, it's unlikely that you would have the member of the council that condemned Jesus to die to go out on a limb and ask for his body. That wouldn't make sense, because that could mean perhaps death or ostracization for this man. Second of all, if this were a made-up story, you wouldn't put Jesus in a tomb. You would throw him into a pit where hopefully the dogs would eat him. So there'd be nothing there. But he takes him and he takes the body, the corpse, and he puts it in a tomb. Now, Jesus was crucified on the Sabbath, and so here's the thing. The Jews didn't work on the Sabbath, so the burial and the preparation, he died on Friday, so the next day is starting the Sabbath, so they had to get this all done Friday evening before the Sabbath started. And so Joseph knew his time was limited. Jesus had died. The Roman soldiers had verified his death, and by the way, folks, Roman soldiers were experts at crucifixion. They crucified thousands of people. These guys were not novices at their job. So when they said he's dead and they punctured his cardium, his heart, he was dead. And they went to Pilate, he's dead. We didn't have to break his legs, he's dead. These guys knew death. They lived around death constantly. And so when Joseph goes to Pilate and says, all right, give me the body, may I have the body? And we have a limited amount of time, Pilate. We need to get him down, we need to get him buried and stuff before the Sabbath begins. Pilate releases the body. Joseph owns a tomb. We also know from the gospel writers that Joseph was a wealthy man. So he had this brand new tomb that he had cut there, and he owns that tomb actually in Jerusalem, the city outside of which Jesus was crucified. So there was no time to get Jesus' body back to Nazareth, where he was from. There was no time to transport his body. They had only a few hours to get this done before sundown. And so Joseph gets the body, and he's like, okay, we're going to have to put him in my tomb, and they're putting them right there in the very city in which he had just been crucified. So Joseph knew where the tomb was at. Jesus was not being buried amongst friends. He was in this graveyard, buried amongst people. He was not buried in a family plot. He was buried in a borrowed tomb. Look at verse 60 again. He left after rolling a great stone against the entrance of the tomb. Now, the Gospels also tell us that Joseph wasn't alone. There was another member of the Sanhedrin called Nicodemus. Nicodemus also had become a follower of Christ. In fact, if you look at John chapter 3, there's this great interaction with Nicodemus and Jesus. And so Nicodemus had been watching Jesus, and Nicodemus knew the Scriptures. And Nicodemus had said, you know what? I think he is the Messiah as well. So we know from the other Gospels that Nicodemus, along with Joseph, were the ones that got him in the tomb and got him ready. And again, they do this at their own risk of being ostracized by the council because they were going against the council. And look at verse 61. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were seated there facing the tomb. This was not a secret. Mary Magdalene, Joseph, Nicodemus, they knew where the tomb was at. And in fact, later, as we look into the story, the Sanhedrin knew where the tomb was at. The Romans knew where the tomb was at. Everybody knew where the tomb was at. Look at verse 62 here. The next day, which followed the preparation day, the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered before Pilate and said, "Sir, we remember that while this deceiver was still alive, he said, 'After 3 days, I will rise again.'" So let me point out a few things. First of all, the religious leaders did not believe he was the Messiah. They did not believe he was the Messiah. They believed that somehow this guy did miracles. They didn't know how to explain the miracles. They didn't know how he had resurrected people from the dead. They didn't know how he turned water into wine. They didn't know all these things. But he did not fit into their concept of what the Messiah would be. They expected the Messiah to come in and to lead them against Rome and to throw off the Romans against their backs and for once again the Messiah to rule in Jerusalem. And that's what they expected. And Jesus didn't do any of these things. He didn't act the way they thought the Messiah should act. He didn't treat the religious traditions the way that they thought the Messiah should treat the religious traditions. He didn't teach the way they thought the Messiah should teach. He didn't respond to their enemies or the sick or the poor the way they thought the Messiah should respond to them. Let me just tell y'all, Jesus had enemies. He had people who hated him. That's why they called for his crucifixion. That's what they wanted. They wanted to kill him. And so here's Jesus. He's been taken off the cross. His body is buried in Jerusalem, right in the middle of enemy territory. Second of all, his enemies remembered that he had predicted he would rise from the dead. They remembered that. And so they were like, okay, look, this deceiver said he would rise from the dead. Interesting that his enemies remembered that, but his disciples seemingly forgot that he was going to rise from the dead. So again, just to recap, Jesus' enemies did not believe he was the Messiah. They believed he was nothing more than a man. And they didn't believe Jesus would rise from the dead. Sounds like a lot of folks today. No way. There's no way this guy could be the Messiah. There's no way this could be the Messiah. Jesus predicted that he would rise the third day. He gave a time frame to his resurrection. It wasn't like someday I'll resurrect. He said, no, I will resurrect on the third day. And so look at what they said. They said, otherwise his disciples may come and steal him and tell the people he has been raised from the dead, and the last deception will be worse than the first. And so what they're afraid of is that somehow the disciples will come and steal the body and say, yes, he did rise from the dead. And then the people are going to start following after them. But folks, let me tell you something. First of all, the disciples fled at the cross, except John. They were in hiding. These guys were scared to death. These guys, most of them have been fishermen or things like that, and a tax collector, which everybody hated Matthew, and there was this ragtag band of people. There was nothing in it for them to make this story up. Because you know what church history tells us? They all died as martyrs. There wasn't like, Matthew saying, you know what, someday if we can pull this off, guys, they're going to build a building after me and call it, St. Matthew's. There wasn't Peter saying, if we can steal his body and pull this off and really pull the wool over on people's eyes, one day there's going to be this St. Peter's Basilica. It's going to be named after me. Oh, let's go. There was nothing in it for them except death. There was nothing in it for these guys. And these guys fled from the cross except John. He was the only one there. And the ladies, all the men chickened out. They took off. But Jesus' enemies knew if somehow this was pulled off and people could be deceived that Jesus had risen from the dead, then we would have a problem. So Pilate, too, realized that they had a point. Because part of the reason that Pilate allowed Jesus to be crucified, even though Pilate said, I really don't find a problem with this guy, and even though his wife had said, don't do this, and he didn't listen to his wife, Pilate realized he was afraid that there would be another insurrection. And you have to remember that the Jews were famous for insurrections. In fact, it's kind of interesting. If you remember the Christmas story, if you remember, they had to flee to Egypt because Herod had the babies killed in Bethlehem, hoping to kill Jesus when he was born. And when they came back, we have this little blip in here that they didn't go back to Bethlehem, back to Jerusalem area, because Joseph was afraid of Herod Antipas. Well, the Bible doesn't really say why, but if you read Josephus, the Jewish historian who wrote about that period, actually in 4 BC, Herod had 3,000 people slaughtered on Passover in the temple. And so I think what was happening in the Christmas story is when Joseph and Mary were on their way back, and people were like, where are you going? Well, we're going back to Bethlehem, where we were at before we had to flee. I imagine a lot of people were saying, don't do it. 3,000 people were just slaughtered. You don't want to go back there. And so because he was afraid, Joseph said, hey, I think we'll just go to Nazareth. The Jews were very known for these insurrections. And so Pilate, knowing that Jesus was wildly popular, he's kind of like, oh, you guys may have a point. We probably need to do something about this. Last thing we need is an insurrection. So Pilate says, okay, you take your guards, the temple guards. I'll let you use your temple guards, and you make sure that that tomb is sealed. Now, it's really interesting here. So he tells them to go and seal the tomb. So look at verse 66. They went and secured the tomb by setting a seal on the stone and placing the guards. Now, this had happened the day after Jesus had been buried. If there was ever a time for the disciples to steal his body, it would have been the night he was buried. After Joseph and Nicodemus had rolled the stone away, if there had ever been a window, it would have been right then for the disciples to come in, get the body out. This story here, this part, happens the next day. So there is no account of the soldiers going back to Pilate and saying, the body's gone. He's been stolen. There's no account of that because guess what? When the soldiers went to start guarding the tomb that next day and put the seal on it, which was usually a clay thing with an insignia, and then they would have a cord, they didn't start saying, hey, he's not here, somebody's stolen his body, because the body was still there. The stone was still there. They go to the tomb, they put the signia on it, they seal it with the cord, and they start standing guard there at the tomb. And remember, these guys knew this was high stakes right here. And the religious leaders had told them, you guys better guard that tomb because if somebody comes in and steals his body, we're going to have a mess on our hand. And, you're going to really tick off Pilate. You're going to get, this is not going to be good. You guys need to stay here and guard this tomb. So they go to the tomb and they guard it. Again, there was no reason for the disciples to steal the body. It was pointless. They were scared to death. Why would they risk their life for a dead man? I mean, and again, you have to put yourself in the disciples' shoes. They had been with this guy for 3 years. They were probably very confused at this point. How in the world could this man who did all these miracles allow people to crucify him? If he was God, why didn't he call the angels and just stop all this mess? And I think the disciples were confused. They were locked. We know from the other Gospels they were in hiding in a room. And I'm sure there was a lot of discussion on why did this happen, how this happened, why didn't he stop it? These guys are confused. And don't forget this, folks. This is huge. At the center of Jesus' message was himself. Jesus said, I am the way. I am the truth. I am the life. At the center of Jesus' message was not doing good works and hope you get to heaven. No, it was him. And now, Jesus, who had put himself at the center of the message of deliverance from the consequences of our sin, is dead. So the disciples are like, how can you kill God? how could this happen? And again, I just want to remind you all, this is a huge difference between Christianity and all other religions. All other faith religions, I hate to use that word and put Christianity in the same box, but we'll just put it there, are built on a works-based model. Hopefully you do a good enough good, and your good will outweigh your bad. All other religious systems are built in some way on a works-based model. Hopefully, when you die, you'll get let in, but you don't know. And the question is, well, how good is good enough? You know, wouldn't that be a horrible way for salvation? Wouldn't it be horrible if that's how God set it up? And that you die and you were really good, but you get right there to before God and God says, man, you were so close to getting into heaven, but you had that dirty thought right before you died. Couldn't let you in, I'm sorry. Wouldn't that be horrible? If you had only helped one elderly lady across the street more, I could have let you in. That would be horrible. But every religion is built on some sort of a works-based, except Christianity. It's built on a person, Jesus Christ. And it's not built on works. It's not how good you can be or how many good things you can do. It's built on grace. And grace is not, it's getting what you do not deserve. None of us deserve heaven. And so Christianity stands apart. In fact, there's a story many years ago of C.S. Lewis. You probably heard of him, wrote Chronicles of Narnia and all sorts of things. There was a bunch of people debating the differences between religions, and C.S. Lewis came in and they said, what's the difference between Christianity and all the other religions? He said, grace. That's the difference. Grace. Christianity is not built on a philosophical system. It's built on a person. Yet this person, Jesus, who said, I am the way, I am the truth, I am the life, is now dead. How's this going to work? And I want you to understand, nobody is anticipating the resurrection of Christ. Nobody. The apostles weren't anticipating, even though he told them over and over he was going to do this, they still just didn't get it because people just don't rise from the dead. So the apostles weren't anticipating this. The religious leaders, they weren't anticipating a real resurrection. They were anticipating maybe his body somehow being stolen. The women who were at the tomb and saw him buried and were at the cross, they weren't anticipating a resurrection. The soldiers who were guarding the tomb, they weren't anticipating a resurrection. Pilate wasn't anticipating a resurrection. Nobody was really believing that this literally could happen. And yet here we are, a couple billion people, 2,000 years later, all around the world, celebrating the resurrection of Christ. Was it because Jesus was a great teacher? No, he was, but that's not why we're here. Is it because Jesus performed a lot of miracles? No, he did, but that's not why we're here. Was it because Jesus wrote a great series of books? No, he didn't write any books. Are we here because Jesus was a political leader? No. Are we here because Jesus was a military leader? No. There's only one reason we're here. He rose from the dead. That's the only reason we're here. He rose from the dead. You say, well, Jim, well, okay. Give me the evidence. Now, I don't have time to go through everything. I was watching a person last night. I can't remember his name, Havernus. He is completing a 5,000-page book on just the resurrection, okay? And he's written 20 other books already. So I'm not going to be able to give you every single evidence and every interlocking evidence, but if you want me to do a series on it, we'll do it. But here's the deal. How do you explain Simon Peter, who went 3 days earlier from denying Jesus in front of a high school teenage girl to now, 40 days later, saying he is risen? How do you go from a guy who withered under a little questioning in the courtyard the night Jesus was being questioned and denied Christ? How do you go from that man who couldn't even stand up to low scrutiny 40 days later standing in the very city outside of which Jesus was crucified saying, folks, he is risen indeed? How do you explain that? How do you explain the fact that he went to his death? And the church tradition says he was crucified upside down. How did he go from being a fisherman to after the resurrection? Now he becomes this itinerant preacher who travels around and teaches and preaches that Christ is resurrected from the dead. And guess what it got him? It got him whipped, it got him beaten, it got him thrown in jail, and ultimately got him killed. Why would he do that if it was all a lie? What about the rest of the apostles, the 11 apostles there that were left? Of course, Judas had committed suicide. How did they go from being gathered in a room those days when Jesus was in the tomb, fearful of the Jews, to 40 days later standing out there in Jerusalem, all proclaiming along with Peter, he has resurrected from the dead? How does that happen? Something happened. Something happened. How do you explain James, the half-brother of Jesus, who did not believe he was the Messiah? And let's not get on to James too much. Would you believe it if your sibling told you they were the Messiah? Probably not. They didn't believe he was the Messiah, and he didn't believe it. But yet, after the resurrection, Jesus appeared to his brother James. How do you explain James then becoming the leader of the church of Jerusalem? His own half-brother, who didn't initially believe, later said, yes, he is risen from the dead. I've seen him. I've talked to him. He is. How do you explain the reaction of Jesus' enemies? If you look here, Matthew 28, if you just go over one chapter real quickly, it says, so Jesus resurrected from the dead and on Sunday, and here's what happened in verse 11 after the resurrection. And they were on their way to the tomb. Some of the guards came into the city and reported to the chief priest everything that happened. After the priests had assembled with the elders and agreed on a plan, they gave the soldiers a large sum of money and said to them, say this, his disciples came during the night and stole him while we were sleeping. Now, here's the thing. They didn't even try to refute the resurrection. When the soldiers came and said, look, we don't know what happened, but we were knocked down by this blinding light, and next thing we know, the stone is away, and there is no body in that tomb. He's resurrected. They're not even trying to refute that story. They're just saying, okay, here's some money. You just tell this story if anybody asks you, and we're just going to give you a story, and you make up that story. So again, by their own admission, even his enemies had to admit something happened that day. Something happened that day. And they said in verse 14, if this reaches the governor's ears, we will deal with him and keep you out of trouble. They took the money and did as they were instructed, and this story has been spread among the people, Jewish people, to this very day. 40 days later, when Peter stood on that housetop and started proclaiming, he is risen, we have seen him, we've been with him for the last 40 days. He is risen from the dead. If the Jewish leaders had wanted to end it right there, all they had to do was to bring the body out. And they knew where the tomb was. All they had to do is say, nope, right here he is. Here's his corpse. Mission accomplished. Go home. But they didn't have a body to bring out because there was no body to bring out. So how do you explain all this? The only way I can explain this is that Jesus resurrected from the dead. And when the disciples were preaching that, they weren't the only ones that saw him. The two on the road to Emmaus saw him. Paul says over 500 people who were alive at the time when he was writing that letter saw him. You had the women who saw him, Mary Magdalene, the women who saw him. There was tons of evidence that Jesus had risen from the dead. And it wasn't a spiritual resurrection either. They ate with him. They touched him. They walked with him. He physically rose from the dead. So how do we explain today that almost 2 billion people are gathered around the world? Because it happened. And you can say, no way, all you want. But as I just showed you at the beginning of the sermon, there's a lot of things 150 years ago, if you were alive, you would have said, no way to, and yet it's here. And you can say, no way to the resurrection all you want to, but it doesn't change the fact that it happened. It doesn't change the fact that it happened. So what does Easter mean for you? Easter bunny? Gathering for lunch? Relatives? A nice church service, new clothes maybe. Here's what it means for me. When Jesus said, I am the way, He didn't say, I am a way. He said, I am the way. I am the truth. I am the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. What Easter means to me is when he resurrected from the dead, that proved what he said was true. Amen. That proved what he said was true. I mean, anybody could say this, but he's the only one I ever knew of that resurrected from the dead. Amen. If you want to make claims like this and you rise from the dead, all right, we'll talk. But he's the only one that resurrected from the dead. And again, we could talk about hours of all the evidences that are there, not only in the Bible, but outside of the Bible. There are external sources that refer to Christ after his resurrection. Here's my question for you. Do you know him as your Lord and personal Savior? I know a lot of people are like, well, you know, when I die, I'll figure it out then. Folks, it's too late. There are some things in life that are just too late. I don't think anybody in here would say, well, when I get to that final exam and walk in that room, I'll start studying. It's too late. You either know the material or you're going to flunk. When you and I cross over, and let's be honest, we're all going to die. When you stand before God, it's too late at that point. And the reality is, you've just heard the gospel. The gospel is this. And you know this about you, and I know this about me. I'm not any better than anybody in this room. We all rebel against God. Just be honest. And if you don't believe me and you think you're perfect, ask your spouse or your girlfriend or whatever. Parents. We all rebel. We all say things that are wrong. We all do things that are wrong. We know it's wrong. God says, don't do this, and we do it anyways. We're born with that sin nature. The Bible tells us that. You know that it's a 2-year-old. Don't put your hand on the stove. What does the kiddo do? Puts their hand on the stove. That's how we're wired. We're born with that sinful nature, and that goes back to Adam, and that's another topic. But here's the deal. God is pure. He is light. We cannot get to heaven. No matter how hard you work, you're never going to be good enough to get to where God resides. Amen. All other religions say somehow, hopefully, maybe you can make it. Jesus says no. The only way is through me. You say, why Christ? Well, first of all, he rose from the dead. On the cross, he took your punishment. God poured out his anger and his wrath on Christ on that cross. And Paul refers to Christ as the gift. For all have sinned and fallen short of God's glory. That's all of us. Paul says the wages of our sin, the payment for our sin is death. We have to pay for our sins somehow before a holy God because we owe him. We have failed. But, Paul says, the gift of God is eternal life. How? Through Jesus Christ our Lord. You see, Christ is God's gift. Christ came to this earth. He willfully walked on this earth, took on human flesh, let us beat him, let us mock him, let us embarrass him, let us crucify him. He took on our sin. He felt the wrath of God on our sin, on our behalf, and he became that sacrificial lamb for you and I. And he is the gift to all humanity. But like the church here has heard me say many times, if you get up on Christmas morning and you see a present under the tree and it has your name on it, and Dan says, oh, that's a nice looking box, but he never goes out and does anything with it, does he get to experience the gift? No, it just sits there. If Dan's going to experience the gift, he has to personally go over and unwrap it and open it up. Christ is God's gift to humanity, but you have to make a personal choice. Are you going to respond? And it takes the hardest thing of all for us as humans. It takes humility. It takes a person getting before God and saying, God, I have to admit I am not perfect. I have rebelled against you. I do things that are wrong. I know they're wrong, and I can't get to heaven. I don't know how this works. But I'll tell you what, God, I've heard about Christ and what he did, and he died and he rose again, and he said he was the way, so I'm going to put my faith and trust in him. I'm asking you to save me. That takes humility. And the biggest obstacle for people to come to Christ is pride. But it takes humility for a person to get on their knees, or you can be driving down the road, doesn't matter. It's that heart of humility that says, I'm tired of running. I'm tired of trying to do it on my own. I give up. Please save me. I want Christ to save me. Please save me. I can't do this anymore. And I don't know if you're here and you've never done that, and I don't know how to explain it, but I'll tell you this. If you will humble yourself before God and ask him to be your Savior and place your faith and trust in him, it's like putting on a pair of glasses that you've never had before. And you know that it's okay. And you will start experiencing a relationship with you. You have to make that step. And you'll never know it until you experience it. So my question to you on this Easter day, Father, every one of us in this room, if we're honest with ourselves, we are just naturally rebellious people, and we've rebelled against you ultimately. And Father, we're gathered today because 2,000 years ago, Jesus, who said he would rise from the dead, rose from the truth and the life. And nobody comes to the Father. Nobody gets to heaven except through. Stop running from you and say, Lord, save me. Running from you and say, Lord, save me. I'm tired of running. I'm tired of my faith and trust in you.